All right, let me begin. What I just say a little bit in advance about what I'm going to do today and tomorrow. Tomorrow is at 1 o'clock, I gather, not 5 o'clock. And all I want to do tomorrow is sum up everything I've done in the last 2 weeks and sort of try and explain all how the bits of the puzzle, if they are bits of the puzzle, cohere in some way. Today I want to look, as I said yesterday, I want to look at almost in terms of a sort of what the French would call an explication de texte, a sort of going through what Deleuze writes in 1,000 Plateaus on the diagram and on the abstract machine. I mean, just partly to just go through it, and those of you who'd like to go through it, that's what I want to do. I also want to link to the sort of things I said yesterday, and then also to begin to worry about the notion of how potentiality operates, both in his way of formulating the diagram and for what it's worth in the way I was trying to do it. I would just say in advance that the general discussion of the diagram and its role in architecture owes an enormous amount to both to Deleuze and Foucault. I mean, in some sense, the word was taken up from them, but then has been deployed in many different ways, a lot of those ways being, in some sense, incompatible with what they said going. Partly because they were not interested in architecture. They were interested in a notion of, as I'll explain, the diagram in and of itself. And our interest is how do we understand the diagram within the realm of architecture. Now, in order to situate this and also to link it in part to the sort of project I was outlining over the last couple of weeks, is if you read Deleuze's work on the diagram, one of the central moments is a critique of the theory of expression, and therefore the implicit critique of expressionism. And it's interesting, just parenthetically, that Walter Benjamin is also very critical of the notion of expressionism. Now, the reason why there is a critique within a materialist philosophical tradition, which would include both Benjamin and Deleuze in this regard, is that expressionism always emphasizes the expressed, what it is that is being expressed, and always then neglects the system organizing the expression. In other words, the critique of expressionism oscillates between, if you want, on the one hand, the denial of the materiality allowing for expression. Sorry. Could we not have this? Could we not have this singing now? And on the other, plays into the hand of meaning. So there is an idealism, if you like. An idealism here is the refusal of materiality and the location of activity in meaning. And it's those two things which combine in a theory of expression. And as I've explained, is that this attack on meaning again forms part of that materialist tradition that you would find now, to use other proper names, running from Gottfried Zemper's work in the book on style, right through to the work of the French literary critic Roland Barthes, who was always interested in, not in content and not in meaning, but the way in which a system organized itself such that it was meaningful. Now, I mean, the evocation of Barthes and Zemper is sort of interesting, because on one level, you would find a similarity of position, namely the effacing of the project of meaning and hence hermeneutics in favor of the system that produced it. And if we left it at that level, it would be fine. We could slip between claims about literature and claims about architecture. However, we can't leave it at that level because architecture and literature are fundamentally different. For example, and it's a trivial thing to say, but I'll say it, their differing negotiations with gravity, for example, mark out the difference. Their differing negotiations with actual materiality mark out their difference. Therefore, a materialist account of architecture that it wants to overcome the centrality of meaning, and a materialist account of literature that also wants to overcome the centrality of hermeneutics and meaning, while they're similar on one level, are radically distinct on another. And it's very important that when we engage with texts like Deleuze and Derrida and whoever it is, it's very important that we don't neglect the specificity of either architecture or philosophy or whatever it is. In other words, it's not as though these terms have direct application. What would always be of interest to us is how they get to be applied within the practice of architecture as opposed to something else. I mean, the obvious example I've used before would be, I'll use it again, is the way in which, for example, the addition of a lightening of colour in the middle of a painting will create the focal point without there having to be perspective. And the example I'm thinking of, if you want to see it, is Peter Bruegel, 16th century Dutch painter. Bruegel's work, doesn't have a focal point because it doesn't have perspective. However, there is a focal point by the lightening of the canvas in the middle, the addition of an underneath base of white paint that's painted over, so there is a lighter part in the middle of the canvas, and that holds the eye without there having to be a perspectival focal point. So it's a technique, therefore. Now, that's a technique that helps produce the work's meaning, but it's a technique operative in painting. Now, if we flip to architecture, the question is, what is a technique similar in architecture that is operative and produces meaning? And it will be fundamentally different. So merely to insist on meaning being an after effect of a system always still forces us back to think about the system itself. Blah, 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 blah. So the critique of expressionism, which Deleuze begins with, is fundamentally part of a critique of a general sense in which we can find Zempa, Benjamin, Barthes, a whole series of writers, all of whom are bound together in this way. But our job is to think their specificity. Otherwise, we just lapse into the arms of cultural studies and it all becomes the same. And we don't want that. We want to allow for particularity. So that's enough to begin with. Now, the way in which Deleuze begins his argument is he wants to describe, or does describe, what he calls an abstract machine as diagrammatic. And then he says, very interestingly, that an abstract machine, it is diagrammatic, it operates by matter, not by substance, by function, not by form. It is and the abstract machine is a diagram independent of the forms and substances, expressions and contents. It will distribute. And this idea of it will distribute becomes fundamental. So what he's identifying is the operation of that which, now to follow Malevich, we could say exists at zero. In other words, what he's coming up with is the possibility of that prior to what there is, which we would then identify, name, give specificity to, etc., prior to what is an organizational system that distributes and allows for what is. In other words, there is an already present organization that allows for the presence of what is. Now, therefore, the diagram in this sense operates both prior to icons and prior to symbols, but in a sense presupposes the possibility of their eventuality. If you go to another part of Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze makes a very interesting, or draws a very interesting distinction between what he calls l'espace lisse, or smooth space, and l'espace strié, or striated space. Now, in architecture over the last 5 or 10 years, this is, or maybe, I don't know how long, maybe 5 years at least, this has become an incredibly important way of thinking about the regimes of space. Now, the way in which, the reason for their importance is the nature of their relationship. And as the same way as I want to talk about the diagram as informing the generation of representations. You can see the same thing in these two senses of space. Smooth space, and the examples he uses are fascinating. He talks about the maritime model. The smooth space is, as you look at the sea, you can sense in the rise and fall of the waves some sense of location. The surfboard rider sitting on his or her board looks at the waves as they begin to rise up and begins to make calculations. Now, these calculations depend upon a particular configuration of space. And that configuration of space is what we would call haptic. Namely, our relationship to it is understood affectively through the question of affect. It's a relation to the haptic. And the example I always use is to do with being in Venice. I mean, the first time you go to Venice, you've got your map, and you work out how to get back to your hotel, and you have no idea how to do it, and you're following little things and looking and trying to work out how to do it, and you think, tomorrow it's just impossible. By day 3, you know exactly how to get there without ever looking at the map. Now, what you've internalized is a body's relation to space. And that becomes, for Deleuze, very interesting. I think in general it's interesting, because that capacity to get back to your hotel in Venice without having to look at all the little street names and canals, your body somehow knows where it is, and which is an experience that everyone who's been to Venice has had after day 2. That experience involves a body's relationship to space that's haptic, that's linked to affect. It's linked to what Deleuze calls smooth space. Now, we don't have to call it smooth space, he does, but it's an interesting way of describing the body's relation to space. Now, if that's all there was, then the world would work on the level of intuition. If that's all there was, then we'd only need intuition to get around. But we don't. It's impossible. Intuition will not give us a way through. And that's why he will say in the end that striated space and haptic and smooth space have to work together. In other words, that the cartographical impulse that gives us longitude and latitude works together with the mariners looking at the sea and he or she knowing through the rise and fall of the waves, the bit of seaweed, the bird, blah, 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 where they are. In other words, the two operate together. And it's very interesting that what Deleuze introduces with this notion of the haptic and the notion of affect. I mean, now that we see it in him, we can go back elsewhere. It's very interesting that the Austrian architect Adolf Loos plays on the fact that in German the word Raum suggests as much to room as it does to space. I mean, there's Zimmer, but Raum plays between the two. And Loos, when he writes in German, which is indeed the only way he writes, plays between the two senses of the word, this sense of room. In other words, in what he's actually trying to do is enact one of these, I've said many times here, the truths of architecture. Namely, for architecture, there is no such thing as space. We know that. Space is created by the operation of walls, or the operation of fields. Space is always created. So what becomes interesting for Loos is that you can only think space linked to a notion of affect, namely that the body's relationship to space. So in Loos's own formulations is the inscription of the affective nature of space as much as it is the need to move to plans and sections to create that. So what Deleuze's distinction, if you like, between smooth and striated space indicates on the basis that they can never be thought together, separately, and on the basis that they have to be thought together, a recognition that this discussion of space in general has to talk about affect. However, and I think this is the key part, it has to be thought in relation to affect, but not instrumentally. In other words, I don't do this to make you feel this. However, in creating a space, there will always be an affective nature. And it's this notion of smooth space in Deleuze, if you like, that opens all of this up. So this continual movement backwards and forwards between that which is, if you like, prior to the representational and the representational becomes a fundamental motif, as it were, in the way in which a lot of his philosophical arguments or philosophical positions are presented. But one doesn't generate the other, the two operate. He even says in the discussion of smooth and striated space that an account of space would be inadequate if one simply remained on the level of affect. In other words, it would be inadequate if it simply remained on the level of intuition, that l'espace lisse and l'espace strié always are interconnected. So therefore, we can begin to see that when he talks about the diagram and the notion of the abstract machine as, in some sense, independent of the things they will distribute, we can begin to see that there is no distribution. In fact, there is no form, substance, expression, content without the diagrammatic. So it's not simply that the diagrammatic is opposed to form, substance, expression, content. It's rather that which is prior to the representational allows for representation. What is prior to expression allows for expression. In other words, that we don't see meaning and expression except as the after effect of a system that works, as I've said all the way through in these lectures. And now, for Deleuze, this system is understood in terms of the abstract machine or in terms of the diagrammatic. The after effect of this is form, substance, expression, and content. Now, just to pause here, if you go back to the critique of Expressionism, if you believed in Expressionism, if you believed in that version of semiotics that worked with the relationship between the signifier and the signified, what you would be doing is already attributing a determinant status to the diagram. In other words, in the Saussurean distinction between signifier and signified, what is shown can be identified and be named. So the distinction between, the famous one of the word rabbit and a picture of a bunny, or the word book and a picture of a book. We know that in other languages, book is livre or whatever it is, buch, but the image stays the same. That relationship between signifier and signified gives a determinant content to each. Now, what Deleuze is trying to do is to say, no, that would be to misunderstand the way in which determination occurs. Determination always arises out of a system that is, as it were, indeterminate. But more than that, that's prior to determination. And in being prior to determination allows for it. What semiotics gives us in that signifier and signified sense is the failure to, as it were, understand the consequences and the source of determination. Now, it's not because I am that committed to the Deleuzean version of it, I am committed in part to it, but it's very clear that if you go back to what I've been trying to argue vis-a-vis Malevich on the zero, or the notion of potentiality, what emerges in each instance from the zero, in Malevich's sense, or potentiality in the way I've been trying to outline it, is that potentiality is always already indeterminate. That's the nature of potentiality. But without potentiality, there couldn't be determination. In Malevich's sense, without the zero, there can't be the one. You don't start with the one, you start with the zero. So there is, therefore, a very interesting affinity, well, I'm hoping there is, an interesting affinity between the Deleuzean version of the diagram, and I'll say a lot more about it in a moment, the Deleuzean version of the diagram, Malevich on the zero, and the sorts of general arguments about the questions of potentiality. So then when Deleuze comes to a discussion of symbols, signs, icons, etc., all of these have to be understood, if you like, as predicated upon the indeterminate nature of the diagram. Now, it's more than that. He then says, and I wanted to spend a bit of time explaining this, he says that the diagram retains the most deterritorialized content and the most deterritorialized expression in order to conjugate them. Now, the word deterritorialization is, I think, a fundamentally important part of the Deleuzean argument. Now, Deleuze doesn't like, for reasons that are totally understandable, the concept of critique. And the reason why there is an ambivalence or a reluctance to use the word critique is that in the philosophical language, critique either ties you into a certain version of Kantianism, which we don't need to worry about, or it ties you into a certain version of critical theory, and that ties you, and therefore that critique is bound up with the postulating of some utopian possibility. So it's a critique in the name of, or it's an imminent critique leading to. Now, Deleuze is not a thinker of critique, but that doesn't mean he's a thinker of absolute passivity, or a thinker of the status quo, whatever that would be. There is a sense in which there is a notion of what we would call, or at least I would want to call, criticality in Deleuze's work. Now, in order to situate that notion of criticality that's there in Deleuze's work, I want to link it just for a moment to what I was saying about Bataille on the informe. Bataille on the informe, that little text which you all must read, Bataille on the informe is interesting for many reasons. One of them is because for Bataille the notion of the informe is itself already a critique of the position that's committed to the already determined nature of form. So when he says in the text I quoted the other day, he says that academic men want everything to take form, that the informe undoes that pretension. So it undoes the idea that there's an always already given understanding of form and form creation. So the informe is not nihilistic, it's not negative, it's productive. It's productive of form, but more than that, it undoes the pretensions that form is already pre-existent. As such, it could be argued that it deterritorializes the question of form. In other words, it takes the question of form and form generation away from its pre-given, already known location and repositions it. Now, that as an argument is actually, I find, for a whole series of reasons, very interesting. One of them is this, is that the problem with the concept of critique is that it is often inextricably bound up with an image of what something else is like. Namely, we don't do this, but we will do that. We shouldn't have it like this, it should be like that. Now, the trouble with utopianism, when it's understood as bound by an image of the future, is that the future is effaced because we already have its image. So there's no future at all. There's simply, we already know its image. So therefore there is, in some sense, the reluctance to even think futurally if that notion of the utopian gives you an image of the future. Now, in order, therefore, to distance that notion of the future, or futurity, if I could use that term, to move it to one side, to get rid of this conception of the utopian, one way of doing it is to say, look, there is a conception of the future, and that conception of the future is the one we make now. In other words, the condition for the future, or the future, is a condition of the present. It's not something projected as an image to come, in which everything will be better, or whatever it is. It's actually a moment in which we reconfigure the present as containing that possibility for something else. Now, in order to maintain that possibility for something else, in which that's not simply utopian and therefore critical in the sense in which Deleuze wants it, we want to take back the question of form. We don't want to say there'll just be formlessness, and we don't want nihilism, in other words. We want that notion of production that comes from Bataille's notion of the informe, and as I'll say a little bit further, from Deleuze's notion of the diagram, or Maliewicz's zero, what I was saying about potentiality, whatever you want. In other words, all of a sudden, what emerges as the critical is not to say this is wrong, or it actually ought to be like this. The critical is to say, I take back the question of form away from the way it's usually treated and redo it. In other words, there is still form, but the thinking of form becomes fundamentally different. It's deterritorialized. And the reterritorialization of it is the most, as it were, anti-utopian gesture possible. It's to say that there is a radical rethinking of form creation, but it's not done in the name of a pre-existent idealized image of the future. In other words, we rework the notion of form creation. And that then becomes, as I was trying to say yesterday or the day before, a way of situating critique, not in terms of a moralism, not in terms, as I said, of some projected other thing, but actually undoing the pretensions that are already given to us. And that becomes, if you like, the question of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. But how does that work? How does that production work? How does one begin to undertake that particular project? Well, one of the ways in which Deleuze wants to think this is in terms of the diagram. He has a very interesting discussion in 1,000 Plateaus where he says that the diagram plays, and I quote, a piloting role, constructing a reality that is, and I quote, yet to come. Now, I mentioned a lot, I'm very taken by this formulation of the yet to come, and I always write it yet dash to dash come, or yet to be. But what's interesting is that one way, and I'm just to repeat the point but not to labour it, one way of understanding the yet to come oscillates on the level of the messianic, or oscillates on the level of the utopian. You know, at a certain moment there'll be flowers, it'll be beautiful, everyone will love each other, there's a yet to come, which everything will be right. Now that's precisely what is being resisted here, is the idea that the yet to come could have an image. The reason why is that if the yet to come has an image, what this induces is pure passivity. Namely, that if the yet to come has an image, it's an image of the future and I await it. That's why many lost and messianic cults sit round awaiting something, as though there's nothing to do except await. But if you don't believe that the future already has a determined image, if you don't believe that, and yet you still believe in a concept, as it were, of futurity, then this idea of diagram playing a piloting role constitutes a reality that is yet to come, constructing a reality that is yet to come. And it's very clear that he uses the word reality. It's not constructing an idealized state of affairs that is yet to come. It's constructing a reality that is yet to come. So it's an absolute commitment to the real. And I just want to say a bit about the real before I move back to this very interesting word piloting, which I'm fascinated by. You know, the real has received bad press of late. And that is because of the reduction of the real to what there is. Namely, that the real is, you know, the cup on the table, the scarf. It's a series of identifiable singular events or singular entities. And that's what's real. And that's then counterposed to the ideal, like the Platonic forms or God or the future or something like this. And yet we don't seem to want to have either of these. And yet we do. But we want to rescue the real from its reduction to simple empirical entities. Now I mentioned this in the very first lecture I gave, and I now want to return to it, though it is a philosophical point, but it's bear with it. I think it's a very interesting one. And I mentioned in the very first lecture the French novelist, who I think is the key thinker of the real, and that's Émile Zola, 19th century French novelist. The reason why I think, as I said in that first lecture, that he's the key thinker of the real is his critique of photography. He argues that photography only ever gives you an image of singular things, like I can have a photograph of this cup, or me, or you, whatever it is. That's not real. It may be empirical, it may be actually existing, but it's not real. And that becomes very intriguing. If that's not real, what is? I mean, sure, look, it must be real. I can hit it, you know, I can drink it, and it must be real. No, that's not what's real at all. And he uses this wonderful expression, the mechanism of facts. All photography does is give you facts. This cup, my glasses, my scarf, blah, blah, blah. However, facts are not real. They're simply isolated occurrences. What is real is the mechanism of facts. What is real is the machinic quality that is the nature of the fact. You can never talk about facts outside of their operation within a machine. That's what's real. So all of a sudden Zola gives us a conception of the real that has nothing to do with what in philosophical terms we would call empiricism. But it's a conception of the real that is linked to what I would want to call in philosophical terms materialism. It's a commitment to the mechanistic, to the machinic nature of the fact. So we need to, as it were, win back the concept of the real from its reduction to empiricism. So when I tell you something's real, I don't mean it's the same as a cup on the table. I mean that it's part of a machine that's at work. And the French novelist, I said, Émile Zola, is, in the 19th century, the great thinker of the real as opposed to empiricism. When he argues that naturalism cannot work with photography, because all photography does is give you facts. What he opens up is the possibility of a rethinking of the real that takes the notion of becoming or process as fundamental. Now, I'm not saying that Zola and Deleuze are the same person at all. I told you the story about Zola because it helps us think about the notion of the real still as a site of invention, still as a site of creativity, but governed not by empirical entities, but conditioned by the fact that there are facts whose operation is always machinic. And the machinic is the term that Zola uses in the 19th century. So that gives us a way into thinking about the real as actual, and therefore as actualizable, but yet to be created. Now, when Deleuze then says that the diagram plays a piloting role, constructing a reality that is yet to come, this reality needs to be understood as a re-territorialization of what there is. In other words, it's not a fantasy. It's not the so-called reality of science fiction. It's not the so-called reality of utopianism. It's based on, as it were, a retelling, if you like, of a story. And it's very interesting, just to go back to Zola. Zola has a real problem. He's a materialist. He believes that there's a mechanism of facts. He believes that you see facts. But he also wants a conception of literature. And that's the great problem. How do you have literature if you believe in materialism, if you believe in facts? Surely what literature does is invent something that isn't true. No, Zola would argue if he'd read Deleuze. What literature does is construct a reality that is yet to come. But a reality that is a reversioning, a revisioning of the mechanism of facts. The insertion into a milieu that's always a self-organizing, adaptable system of new events, to see what happens to those events and to see the way the system or the milieu adapts. Zola was a keen reader of Darwin, and there's an implicit Darwinianism in here, but it's an adaptability that works as much to the event or the occurrence as the milieu, Zola's word, in which this is placed. So therefore there's a very interesting affinity between this notion of reality in Deleuze and someone like Zola's commitment to the real. So we need to think this notion of realism. Now, when Deleuze says that the diagram plays a piloting role, in this word piloting we have to hear the twofold elements that I've mentioned before. That the first is that the diagram plays a role in deterritorializing, namely that the diagram allows for an abstraction. Now, what does that mean? Remember when I tried to argue, not yesterday, but I've forgotten when it was now, not yesterday, the day before. Seems like forever. When I looked, we had the Malevich drawings on the board, and I said the challenge is to see those volumes or those lines as objectless. In other words, the challenge is to see those as zero. Now, that's what Malevich wants us to do. Now, in Deleuzian terms, that becomes a deterritorialization of that image. Namely, the capacity to reduce, as it were, that image to the position of zero, or to see it as a diagram. It's to rid it of its already iconic symbolic investments and allow it another existence. Now, what becomes interesting then is and again I think this is worth noting, is, as it were, the anti-utopian gesture within that. And if you then flip this into architecture, I mean, one of the most utopian architects on the level of the image would be certainly the Libaeus Woods of the 80s, in which you saw spaceships, or you saw an architecture that was bound up with an image of the future that had to do with the creation of futural objects. Or, to flip it round, you have the sort of postmodern vision of the future, which is the future based on size. In the future, everything will be really big, which is the notion of architecture in Blade Runner. Namely that, the temple, the use of the Mayan temple, which is just 98 stories, whatever it was, and I think Descartes lives on the 98th story of his apartment blocks. Everything was done by enormous size. That gave you an image of the future. The notion of the diagram, or Malievich's zero, gives you a different way of understanding the future. Namely, you don't see these objects as already the image of the future. You see them as the diagram, and in the diagram there is this possibility of realizing that which is yet to come. And that becomes very interesting. So I think, and I'm going out on a limb here, I think there's a real affinity between the Deleuzian notion of deterritorialization and Malievich's insistence that we see the object as objectless. In other words, both of them, whether they realize it or not, are advocating a notion of abstraction that has to be thought within a structure of productivity or potentiality. To that extent, it's critical of the idea that form is already given in advance. Therefore, we have to now go back to, we're almost ready to confront the word piloting. Diagram plays a piloting role. Now this becomes the complicated part, because in the case of literature, the piloting role we can understand. But what in architecture would the piloting role be? What in architecture, when I keep going on about this, have to see this as objectless, we have to see it as abstract, have to see it diagrammatically, what happens then? How do you move from the diagrammatic? How do you enact, as it were, the yet to come? Well, the first thing we need to say in addressing this aspect of the diagram, there are two things I want to say. The first is that once we get rid of the idea of the utopian, once we get rid of an idea of the future as an inexorable movement towards something, what we get rid of are two things. The first is that the development of form is thought teleologically, namely through inexorable development. But equally, we get rid of the idea that there's such a thing, as I said the other day, as forma finalis, or final form. Now, traditionally, we would use teleology and final form to give us the movement to it. Whether we thought it pragmatically, in terms of this image becomes that, and it's an inexorable movement all the way through, and hence my lecture on the archive was meant to undo that. Or it's thought in some sort of utopian sense that we will lead to this thing, and here's the final image of the future. That's what it will be like. Now, once we, get rid of all of that, what happens? Well, firstly, the notion of forma finalis, or final form, vanishes. Which doesn't mean then that anything is possible, far from it. But the notion of final form vanishes. But once the notion of final form vanishes, equally the idea of time as teleological development also vanishes. So therefore we have an interesting state of affairs. We now have to think the notion of piloting outside of the notion of forma finalis, or final form, but equally outside of the idea of teleological development. So what's the pilot do when there's nowhere to go to, and there's no way of getting there? So what does final form mean? What does piloting mean? Now, and that's what I want to address. When I take this up, for what it's worth, I want to draw a distinction, as I did a little while ago, between the illustration and the diagram, in which the illustration merely shows you something, while the diagram has a different status. Now, I agree, for what it's worth, that the diagram must always be linked to the notion of the yet to come, But how is that realized? Now, let's then divide the architectural project along two paths. Let's say that there is such a thing as volume, because there is. Let's say that there is such a thing as program, because there is. Now, what we tend to do when we think of the diagram is we think of it as having a relationship to volume, or think of it as a relationship to form, which we understand volumetrically. Namely, that we analyze, in the end, something takes place that looks like a volume and becomes one. And so we tend to think of the piloting role of the diagram linked to volume. Now, it seems to me that there's another way, or a further way, not another way, a further way, of understanding the question of the diagrammatic. And that is that we can use programs such as, whatever they are, Rhino is a very good one, in which to study adjacencies. And in studying adjacencies, you can give different weightings to the things that are adjacent, W-E-I-G-H-T. And those weightings are not volumetric, the weightings are linked to understanding differing programmatic considerations. And on that level, one can begin to develop what I would want to call a programmatic diagram. In other words, you can use the diagram not to think about volume at all, despite what it may look like on the screen, but to understand the relationship of spatial organization and programmatic considerations. And on that way, you can begin to make claims that there's such a thing as research on the level of program. Not straightforwardly function as in a straightforward sense, but the way in which you can begin to explore these connections. Now, the question is, what happens at this particular point? What happens is that you get a diagram of the relationship between certain programmatic units. You have an image of that. But if that image is not understood volumetrically, the question then becomes, what's it like for a programmatic diagram to attain volume? Before I answer that, and I'm sure there's no one answer, let's flip it round and say that what we're interested in now is a volumetric diagram. We're interested in, for example, the way in which connection or circulation may generate an understanding of a particular volumetric location space. In other words, we construct it on the level of circulation. We don't just construct it by creating a box, but we construct it by using diagrams that link to circulation. And eventually, as circulation becomes intense in certain points and is weaker in other points, as that is run through time, one begins to see in what sense there are volumetric considerations linked to that understanding of the diagram. Now, in order to avoid formalisms, namely that you turn one into a building or the other into a building, you can begin to see in what sense that the volumetric diagram and the programmatic diagram come to be interconnected. In other words, the study of circulation gives you a series of relationships that lend themselves to spatial creation. But once you then want to say, but actually, what gives the density to circulation at one point is that it's a cafe as opposed to this. What allows for the dissipation of circulation at one point is that it's a lift shaft or a stairs, and that's what does it. Then all of a sudden, into your volumetric diagram, you're beginning to have to incorporate what you've already seen programmatically. In other words, it's the twofold relationship between the programmatic diagram as itself a separate site of architectural research and volumetric diagrams as themselves a possible separate site of architectural research, that you can begin to see in what sense there are two differing organizational possibilities at work. And what becomes interesting is the reality that these organizational possibilities can begin to intersect at various forms. So instead of taking, the joke that everyone always tells, but I quite like it, is that you can do a programmatic diagram in which you show a series of adjacencies, which if you're Rem Koolhaas, you drop in a box and therefore worry about it. If you're Greg Lynn, you extrude it and build it. but they're two differing responses to the same state of affairs. In other words, a programmatic diagram does not entail an automatic volumetric expression. In the same way that a volumetric diagram does not entail an automatic understanding of programmatic relations. It can do, but it may not. And it's that fact that one thing does not automatically entail the other that means that in your absolutely specific organizational systems, you're always going to confront the question of, given this configuration of program as I've understood it, what's its volumetric expression like? Given this organization of volume as I've understood it, what's its programmatic expression like? Now, what's the answer to that question? Well, let's work out the conditions for answering that question. I've already said that what happens when you take this notion of the yet to come or piloting seriously is that you get rid of a notion of final form. So we don't know what the final form is. We can't even project a form. Equally, what also goes with put in abeyance is the idea of teleological development. So there is no inexorable path. So both of these things have vanished once we think of the zero in Malevich, or the diagram in Deleuze, or potentiality as founding the basis of an architectural site of research. So what's the answer? Well, the answer is that what you've actually created is a domain of testability. In other words, what you've created is a locus of experimentation. What you've done is, instead of the naive view that experimentation is, oh, let's try anything and just see what happens, the sort of experimentation view of the 60s, you now have a very precise sense of understanding what experimentation is. Namely, I have no idea what the result is going to be, but I have delimited and demarcated a locus in which I can test propositions. I can see in what sense this certain configuration of program is linked to volume and vice versa. In other words, that the getting rid of finality, allowing notions like the zero, the inform, whatever it is, to be generative, means that there's no, as it were, image of the future. But that doesn't mean that anything is possible. I mean, one of the disturbing parts about the critique of finality is everyone says, oh, then it's just relativism. Everything's possible. There's no criteria. Just do what you like. Well, there is that school of thought, but they're sort of postmodern and silly. What's interesting is to say that there is an absolutely determined locus of investigation that's always specific, and in being specific locates a term that we need to think more about, and that's a region. And the region becomes the site of testing, the site in which various projects get to be tried out and worked through, that precisely because there is no one way of doing it, what becomes interesting then is establishing a field of testability. Now, one way, of the many ways of beginning to understand that, would be to see such a thing not simply as diagrammatic, but involving what Deleuze calls, a machinic assemblage, or the abstract machine, or any of these sorts of formulations. Namely, that what you've got is something that is operative, that is always going to generate representations, generate expressions, generate icons, symbols, indexes, etc., etc., etc. But it's only their generation that becomes then the site of investigation. What matters for us is that we can create the terrain that makes that possible. And creating the terrain that makes that possible is by holding to the diagrammatic until the very end. In other words, to hold back from finality till the very end, by seeing everything as diagrammatic, and at that stage yet to be, but it's in that mode of operation that it becomes possible to advance conjectures, to make arguments, and to deal with varying possibilities. In other words, that it's the retention of something like this sense of the diagram, or this notion of the zero of potentiality, that opens up this as a mode of thinking, and therefore gives you the possibility of testing. of research. And I think one of the interesting things that I've always tried to do in when I'm involved in teaching studio is make students show the project that they rejected as well as the project they accepted. Because everyone knows, you tell the story as though it moves inexorably to one thing, but that's not true. But what then becomes interesting is for a student to explain, or a group of students to explain, we went down this path and we didn't think it worked for the following reasons. That's actually just as architecturally interesting, or potentially as such, as the student who says, this was the only possible way of doing this. Nonsense, it wasn't. You rejected lots of things. And then what becomes interesting in the truth of the architectural moment is that both are in play. Namely, this was rejected for the following reasons, this was accepted for the following reasons. That's the truth of the fact that there will be a play of forces at work, of varying possibilities arising. But that's not the varying possibilities of relativism. It's not the varying possibilities of how you can do anything. It's the varying possibilities given the removal of final form and teleology and the retention of the productive nature of the diagram. So Deleuze's work, therefore, to me, and I'm skating over various parts of it, is fundamental. One, because it gets around the idea that there's just pure intuition and the purely haptic, which I have to say is based on a lot of people argue this, and is based on a fundamental misreading of Deleuze and an incorporation of far too much Bergson into Deleuze. And there are people who argue this, and I think I would argue strenuously it's to misread Deleuze. When he talks about the relationship between the smooth and the striated, what becomes clear is that affect, if it becomes architectural, must always lead to building. It's not about just feeling. There is no way in which affect can exist without the incorporation of smooth and the striated together. So therefore, it's not. So Deleuze's work allows us to overcome this reduction of affect to intuition. But equally, the getting rid of the utopian, as far as I'm concerned, is fundamental, and that it locates him in that version of the modernist tradition that sees the future as tied up with the move to tectonic possibilities. But the move to tectonic possibilities here arises out of the diagram. It arises from the diagram as itself the condition for the possibility of the tectonic, or the possibility of tectonic realization, or, to put it more brutally, on the possibility of form. In other words, the possibility of form is, to use Bataille's language, the informe. So the informe is not the formless, as I said last night, it's the informe qui forme. It's the formless which forms, but it forms outside of teleology, etc., etc., etc. So I would argue very strongly that the informe and the diagram are fundamentally similar. They give us a way of thinking, a condition for form's creation that is not that of inexorable teleological development. So what I tried to do then in making elements of Deleuze, and obviously there's a lot more to Deleuze, but what I'm trying to insist upon is what happens when we read him as architects rather than what happens when we read him as sort of philosophers or people who are just into affect or whatever it is. And that is that the architectural thrust, I mean, I hate to just pick on this one line, but is to be located in this notion of the diagram as a piloting role. Namely, that when he says it's a piloting role constructing a reality that is yet to come, what does that mean architecturally? And it would be one could run a whole studio around that line and say, all right, what does that mean? How does one understand the future architecturally? And it's only by locating it in that which is abstract, that which is prior to but the precondition for, that it's possible to think the future. And the interesting thing is, as I said, what that does is make the future a condition of the present, not of the future itself. So architecturally then, the piloting role becomes, from what I said yesterday, becomes the relationship between hardware and software. In other words, that the diagram plays a piloting role, not because it's a diagram, but because of what I referred to yesterday, as that relationship between the material, the hardware, and the immaterial, the software. And it's the relationship between the two, and it's only that relationship that allows the diagram to play a piloting role. Because the diagram outside of architecture can be whatever you want. Inside of architecture, it's unthinkable, I would suggest, outside of that relationship between those two. So, to use the language I was using yesterday, what I would want to call a plural event, namely event of ontological plurality, the material and the immaterial, is in architecture the precondition for the diagram being operative. In other words, it's grounded in, therefore, what I was saying yesterday, a relationship between the machine and practice. And that's the way, and therefore, to give a theory of the diagram doesn't, to my mind, have to go down the path of the critique of representation, etc., etc., etc. That means you want to do that, you can. But Deleuze allows you to do that because what he talks about as the diagram being contrary to theories of expression, that's not a problem. But in order to understand how the piloting role, that's only thinkable because of a notion of practice. In other words, we can't lapse again into the arms of idealism. We have to maintain practice as fundamental. But what practice is, in this sense, linked to the diagrammatic, is that operational relationship between hardware and software. And therefore the fact that the differing forms of software become ways of thinking the activity of practice. So therefore, as I said, diagram is a wonderful word to use and should be used all the time, etc., etc. Much like Malevich is zero and those sorts of things. However, it needs to be situated. It needs to be understood architecturally. And to understand it architecturally means that it's then bound up with the way in which architecture represents itself. And the way in which architecture represents itself is obviously through its history, through drawing, through all sorts of possibilities. But if we insist upon the deterritorializing move in which the plan of Farnsworth is reduced to a diagram, for example, then that in being zero means that the one must be discontinuous with that zero on the level of the image. How can that be drawn? Well, I would argue, not the only way, because I would never say that, but one of the most exacting ways is through the incorporation of the zero as a digital image, so that the one then becomes what happens in moving from that particular point to something else. And that's only possible, and I can't tell you what the content of that is, how could I? But that's only possible if practice in architecture is defined by this plural event, which is the relationship between the materiality of the machine and the immateriality of the software. The two only ever work together, but in working together, they set up a whole series of ranges of possibilities, the formal presence of which eschew any sort of predictability. So therefore, in sum, the diagram is fundamental, but not because it's a critique of representation, not because it suggests a representation to come. That is fundamentally important, but more important because within architecture it insists upon a way of drawing that has to resist the notion of predictability, or has to produce a notion of final form as being, as it were, given in advance, or expected or envisaged. And the way that happens is, as I've said, by thinking about this notion of the material and the immaterial. Now, there may be other ways to do that. I can't argue that against that. I don't know. What becomes interesting and fundamental here is that the capacity to move to the yet to come has to be understood as experimentation. And experimentation is not the sense where you confirm an event. Experimentation is where you discover something. In other words, experimentation in English, as you know, means you confirm something. But equally, I experiment to discover. But I experiment within a predetermined setting. And that setting involves programmatic diagrams, involves volumetric diagrams, it involves the relationship between the material and the immaterial, and therefore the relationship, as I outlined yesterday, between machine and practice. And that gives you the setting in which it becomes possible to think of the diagram as architectural, as opposed to anything else, as opposed to being purely philosophical. There's no point arguing or making the assertion within architecture that the diagram is linked to an abstract machine and blah, 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 blah. I mean, that's absolutely fine until you have to say, okay, we accept that. Now, what does that mean within the practice of architecture? Not for architecture in some envisaged ideal state, but for the practice of architecture. Well, that means that we give a lot of thought to what practice means. That's what I tried to do yesterday. So you can see then that the diagram is fundamental, but within a certain, not reconfiguration, but a certain reterritorialization, to use Deleuze's language, of the architectural. Okay. Well, and that's already an hour. I'm quite happy to take questions, but they're the sort of things I wanted to do, is try and situate the value of Deleuze's philosophical insights into the project of architecture. And it's not a question of applying it to architecture, but of actually trying to describe the locus of the architectural, which I did yesterday as, machine and practice and ontology, doing that, and then allowing this notion of the diagram to run through it. Okay, that's as much as I wanted to do today. What I want to do tomorrow is, in some sense, in a very real sense, talk a lot about Deleuze and Benjamin, and see how aspects of all of this work begins to cohere to a more general theory of the architectural, which I want to develop in terms of what I will call a material event, and try and show how all these elements not cohere to sort of give you the answer, but cohere to provide a way of thinking what architectural theory might be in the age of digital reproducibility. So that's as much as I want to do today. It's probably enough. But are there questions? It's not compulsory. If there are, that's fine. If there aren't, that's fine as well. Okay, well then I'll stop there. Thank you very much. That'd be great. I'd be so appreciative if you'd do that. Perfect. That's great. Thank you so much.